Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it very much, you coming out today. There's a lot going on in Washington, D.C., but there really, in our view, is nothing more important than the pension crisis running throughout the states. My name's John Tillman. I'm the CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. As all of you certainly know, Illinois is a leading policy indicator of what not to do in terms of public policy, and this is certainly true in the area of public employee pensions. We have $167 billion in unfunded pension debt. We are leading the nation in that terrible category, but we are just one of many that have a major crisis facing us. And of course, this pension debt is a spending-driven debt, and in order to fix this problem, we have to rein in the structural spending programs that drive this out-of-control unfunded debt. Just to show you how in Illinois to do it wrong, we decided to try to fix our unfunded pension debt with a $7 billion tax hike that we were told would be temporary and would solve all of our problems, including paying down about $5 billion in past due bills. Instead, what happened is every dollar of that pretty much went to pay public employee pensions. Tax hikes do not work to solve the problems. It must come on the spending side. An interesting thing that's happening in Illinois is in the 2012 budget book, the state of Illinois floated the idea of a federal bailout of our state pensions. Great idea. We spend too much, we act irresponsibly, and then the other 49 states should pay off our debt. We think that's a preposterous public policy position, and we've quickly worked to staunch that in Illinois, and we think we have to stop that nationwide. The most important thing is that we can't let this happen throughout the country. This would be a $2.5 trillion transfer of money from people who work and pay taxes to government employees who have pensions that are unsustainable. The fact that these deals were made in such a way that they are unsustainable and the math simply does not add up does not mean we should add another $2.5 trillion to the $16 trillion in federal debt we have. We're very excited to have with us Senator DeMint and a number of other folks who are experts in this area to share their views with you. Next up is my colleague from the Illinois Policy Institute, our Vice President of Policy, Ted Dabrowski.
Thank you, John. As new transparency rules demand more truthful reporting of state liabilities and pensions, we're seeing liabilities across the nation skyrocket. Total underfunding of state pension systems now is reported at $2.5 trillion, but new reports are saying that it's $4 trillion. These amounts are so large that we can expect some states to begin asking for some kind of federal support, what most of us would call a bailout. The Illinois Policy Institute has built a model that measures the impact of a $2.5 trillion bailout of the state pension system. And it shows how it rewards states that are fiscally irresponsible, and it punishes those that are responsible. To bail out state pensions, the federal government would need to raise $2.5 trillion by increasing taxes and cutting spending. That, of course, would affect different states in different ways depending on their individual tax bill and how much it would increase given a tax hike, and how they would be affected by the spending cuts. The federal government would then take that $2.5 trillion and distribute it to all the different states based on their pension shortfalls. And this is exactly where the problem starts. Not surprisingly, states like Illinois and California would be big winners, and I say winners between quotes. They would be big winners because they would receive a lot of money from the federal bailout. And it would punish states such as Tennessee and Virginia, who would be the losers. And the nopensionbailout.com website is a model that captures all those winners and losers, and it's here, a graphic is here to my right. Many states would end up losing money under a federal bailout scenario, but the reality is that all states would lose because this would destroy fiscal federalism and fiscal state rights. It's important that we have brought this model to bear because we don't believe anybody has done a work like this to measure the impact and how it would affect our nation and states across the country. In the last few bailouts, we've seen that the crises come so quickly, and the solution for bailout is the one that's quickly accepted. We saw that with the General Motors, we saw that with the banks, we're seeing that in Europe. And so we thought that it was important to create this model and to begin a national discussion about the problems of pensions and to make sure that everyone understands the crisis at hand. At this moment, I would like to turn over to Senator DeMint for him to touch on the national issue here.
Thank you. Thank you. I am Senator Jim DeMint. It's great to be with you. It seems like we're finally pushing this into the heads of the American people that we have a problem at the federal level with unfunded liabilities, in addition to our $16 trillion debt. It's certainly an election year issue as we focus on that problems. But we haven't begun to get people informed about the potential problem that's coming from the state level, probably their state level, since most states are in trouble here. In my role as the ranking Republican in the Senate on the Joint Economic Committee, we have studied the state pension system for several years. And we will come out in the next few days with an updated report on state pension funds all over the country. And I appreciate the work that's being done here today, because our greatest concern is that states will assume that they can run their pension systems into bankruptcy and then come to the federal government for a bailout. That appears to be the attitude of many states who are making the problem worse rather than better. So our point here today is with the data that's coming, not just from Illinois, but in a few days we'll have similar data for the whole country, is to begin to inform the American people of the problem that they have in their states, and to create a sense of urgency with their legislators to do something about the problem. But for too long, really for decades, state legislators have endeared themselves to government workers by passing along benefits that will be paid by future generations and by future legislators. States have to balance their budgets, but they can make promises in the future that don't affect this year's budget. And now, in most states, the most powerful voting bloc are government workers, particularly government unions. And now we have a conflict of interest with state legislators who are afraid to deal with this important issue. We cannot live in a country where the federal government is broke, states are going bankrupt, and we're already seeing all over the country many municipalities are going bankrupt, primarily because of the promises made for government workers and particularly retirement benefits that will be paid out over the next several decades. States are fooling a lot of their constituents with accounting methods that would put any business in jail when they report the condition of their pension funds. So what we're trying to do here today is to get out the truth, to help people understand the reality, and to create a sense of urgency with state legislators and governors to deal with this problem immediately, so that we don't see over the next few years state after state come into the federal government to get a bailout. And this would be unprecedented. It would create huge tension between the states that are trying to do the responsible thing and those that are waiting for a federal bailout. So I appreciate the data, the chance to shine a little light on this issue, and we'll continue to work with all of you to make sure the American people know what their state legislators are doing.
Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Williams, Director of Tax and Fiscal Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. We're the nation's largest nonpartisan individual membership organization of state legislators, with roughly 2,100 state legislative members across the 50 states. There are many reasons that we are skeptical of a federal bailout of the states. I'm just going to focus on 3 of those today. For instance, a federal bailout of the states ignores the chief contributing factor to state fiscal problems, which is out of control state spending. If you go back just the last decade, our friends at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University calculated that state and local spending growth outpaced the private sector by 90% over that decade alone. Clearly, this is unsustainable. Secondly, a federal bailout of the states really poses a moral hazard for the states. It basically says, states, you can live outside of your means, and the federal government's going to come in and bail you out time and time again. And then finally, a federal bailout of the states is not helpful in the long run for states. It may propose a short-term benefit for states, but certainly has long-term costs. Some of the long-term costs include the many strings that were attached to the last time we had a federal bailout of the states, namely maintenance of effort requirements that prevented fiscally responsible state legislators from taking actions necessary to balance their budgets. Furthermore, academic work suggests that every $1 in federal aid to the states results in state tax increases of 33 cents to 42 cents, meaning that federal bailouts of the states just hurt state taxpayers in the end. To this end, our Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force has adopted model resolution urging skepticism over federal bailout of the states. We were encouraged that the state of Illinois passed Resolution 720 last year with broad bipartisan support, saying thanks but no thanks to federal dollars. It reminds me of the quote from the famous philosopher Yogi Berra, also known for playing for the Yankees, which once said, "This feels like deja vu all over again." We've tried a federal bailout of the states before, it hasn't worked, and there's no reason to go forward with another federal bailout. Now I'm pleased to introduce the next two speakers today are the public and private sector chairs of our Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force at ALEC. First, you'll hear from Senator Jim Buck of Indiana, who's been a leader on this issue, as well as Bob Williams, President of State Budget Solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's good to be with you. I want to congratulate the Illinois Policy Institute for bringing this issue forward. It's something that, as we examine the preamble to the Constitution, it says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice." If you think of the word justice and think of a bailout for pensions, there is no justice to the states that are striving to do for their citizenry the right as it comes to funding those pension funds. We are going to end up pitting states against one another because the old adage, those that reward something will get more of it, those that punish will get less of it. We are in an era where legislators all across the country, even on the Capitol Hill, try to elect people that will be responsible. In ALEC, we talk about individual responsibility. It's high time that state legislators take their own individual responsibility and start doing for the people what they're expected to do, live within their means. Indiana has worked very hard in order to balance our budget, to live within our means, and make sure that our pension funds are solvent. Any other state should be required to do the same for their people. But to go to the federal government and ask them, being the states, to help bail them out with our hard-earned money that we could use for economic development, job growth, is not justice. So again, I want to compliment the Illinois Policy Institute for bringing this issue forward and look forward to a rightful resolution to it. Introduce now Mr. Williams.
Thanks, Senator. I am Bob Williams, the private sector chair of the ALEC Tax and Fiscal Task Force and also President of State Budget Solutions. You know, any proposal for a federal bailout of state and municipal pensions would encourage state and local politicians to avoid solving the pension problem at the state and local government. If state and pensions are too big to fail, then the managers of those funds will continue their untoward behavior in terms of pensions. Bill Gates Jr., who's not known as a conservative, has said over the next couple of years, thousands of teachers will be laid off across America because of the fraudulent, that's his word, not mine, fraudulent accounting systems that state and local governments use to account for pensions. And I couldn't agree more with him. For example, in California, they are required to have a balanced budget. In California, they are required to fund the annual required contribution to pension. What have they done? Over the last 10 years, they have underfunded the required annual contribution to pensions by $17.9 billion. That's $17.9 billion. So not only do they have to make up the $17.9 billion they didn't invest in pensions, they also have to make up the lost interest earnings on that. One other example, since we're talking about Illinois. In Illinois, in the last 10 years, they've underfunded pensions, the annual required contribution by $5.4 billion. But in addition to that, in June 2003, they took out a $10 billion loan, pension bond, to pay for pensions. They haven't repaid that. So now not only do they have to make up the $5.4 billion they haven't paid in pensions, but in addition they have to make up the $10 billion loan they have outstanding, plus the lost interest earnings. ALEC has a solution. We call it reality-based budget, performance-based budget. We also have solutions in terms of pension-type reform, which is needed. But a federal bailout will delay the needed reforms that are the responsibility and the constitutional responsibility of states and not the federal government.
Good afternoon. I'm Jagadish Gokhale at the Cato Institute. I'm happy to be here to talk about the question about federal bailouts of state governments on account of their poor budget management, in particular with regard to their pension plans. This is an emergent issue, and foremost among the states that are talked about in terms of a bailout are California and Illinois. I just want to remind you of the fundamental principles of public finance that bear on this issue. The first one is simply the benefit principle of funding public goods. Since the public benefits of state expenditures, especially state employee services, teachers, firefighters, policemen, and so on, accrue to state residents, the cost of providing these services should be borne by state residents and not the residents of other states or from some other source. Second, we need to avoid moral hazard. States are sovereign entities. They are very well capable of assessing their own needs for public services and coming up with the revenues to fund them. A federal bailout would only reward poorly managed states and would punish states that are well managed, thereby eroding the incentives of all the states to be responsible in managing their fiscal finances. So such a reward penalty calculus should really operate through the state's political and electoral processes, but a federal bailout will basically dilute that connection. So, as I said, the benefit principle is primary in considering how public services should be financed. But suppose there's some extenuating circumstance that that principle, which clearly applies here, for some reason doesn't apply. The second principle then is the ability to pay principle. And we are invoking that principle, it seems to me, unjustifiably. But even if that was evoked, we would say then, based on the ability to pay, does it make sense for the federal government to bail out the states? Well, the federal government's own finances are in such dire shape. We know that the implicit plus explicit liabilities of the federal government run into tens of trillions of dollars. It doesn't seem appropriate to, on this principle, to have a federal bailout of the states. And so for those three reasons, I think the entire emergent question about the federal government bailing out the states is just misguided. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Jason Richline from the Heritage Foundation. I'll be real quick. I just wanted to emphasize something that Senator DeMint had alluded to earlier regarding the systematic underreporting of the costs of public pension funds. We hear a bit different estimates of the liability. Some are 1 trillion, some are 2 trillion, some are 4 trillion. I've heard 5 trillion. What is the source of those differences? Well, the main source of differences is in the assumption of the discount rate. What I mean by that is essentially the assumption of how much or what rate of return the pension funds will get on their investments. Right now, public pension funds are allowed to assume very high rates of return, and without taking into account the risk of not actually getting those returns. So they look at what the average return has been over time, and they just assume they're going to keep getting that over and over again, never pricing the cost of that risk into the overall pension fund. Now, this obviously has major effects on what the overall liabilities are, but it also affects something else. It affects public employee compensation questions. We want public employees to be paid fair market rates, but if you use proper accounting, you can realize that public pension benefits to workers are excessively generous compared to the private sector. I think in terms of the 401k that a typical private sector worker might get, the employer contribution to that fund might be something like 4 or 5% of salary. And now think about the value of a defined benefit plan in those sort of 401k terms. I'll use Chicago teachers as an example, because it's obviously been in the news lately. The strike has just ended. And throughout that strike period, we've heard only about the salaries. And it's true, the Chicago salaries are fairly high compared to other teachers in the nation. But probably the more important aspect of compensation for Chicago teachers and for many public workers is the retirement benefits. If you took the value of the defined benefit pension for Chicago teachers and converted it to a yearly cost in the sense of what you'd have to put into a fund in order for that to actually pay off, given the guarantee associated with it, it would be roughly 40% of salaries, 40. It's obviously considerably higher than what someone in the private sector gets with a 401k. I think this entire discussion of a federal bailout could have been avoided a long time ago, just with more transparency about what the costs actually are. If taxpayers knew each year exactly how much they have to put into public employee retirement funds, then we wouldn't have those excessive benefits in the first place. So we have a major crisis to deal with, no doubt about it. But I think going into the future, to avoid future crises, we can add the transparency that is so lacking in public pension financing, and hopefully we won't have this problem again. Thanks.
Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it very much, you coming out today. There's a lot going on in Washington, D.C., but there really, in our view, is nothing more important than the pension crisis running throughout the states. My name's John Tillman. I'm the CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. As all of you certainly know, Illinois is a leading policy indicator of what not to just to show you how in Illinois to do it wrong, we decided to try to fix our unfunded pension debt with a $7 billion tax hike that we were told would be temporary and would solve all of our problems, including paying down about $5 billion in past due bills. Instead, what happened is every dollar of that pretty much went to pay public employee pensions. Tax hikes do not work to solve the problems. It must come on the spending side. An interesting thing that's happening in Illinois is in the 2000, this would be a $2.5 trillion transfer of money from people who work and pay taxes to government employees who have pensions that are unsustainable. The fact that these deals were made in such a way that they are unsustainable and the math simply does not add up does not mean we should add another $2.5 trillion to the $16 trillion in federal debt we have. We're very excited to have with us Senator DeMint and a number of other folks who are ex-due in terms of public policy, and this is certainly true in the area of public employee pensions. We have $167 billion in unfunded pension debt. We are leading the nation in that terrible category, but we are just one of many that have a major crisis facing us. And of course, this pension debt is a spending-driven debt, and in order to fix this problem, we have to rein in the structural spending programs that drive this out-of-control unfunded debt. 2012 budget book, the state of Illinois floated the idea of a federal bailout of our state pensions. Great idea. We spend too much, we act irresponsibly, and then the other 49 states should pay off our debt. We think that's a preposterous public policy position, and we've quickly worked to staunch that in Illinois, and we think we have to stop that nationwide. The most important thing is that we can't let this happen throughout the country.